So I'm just working on filling in the rest of this cliff with the details and the shading, since I left this one unfinished for probably about a year and a half or better, I would say. And this is a full Bic pen illustration, and I didn't draft it first or anything like that. It's all freehand and unplanned. So for me, that's my favorite way to go about it, is to just start going. So I like to just, whatever happens, happens, and just go with the flow with it. And I find that this helps you to kind of learn and just go with the flow, rather than having a set thing that you have to draft out and do all the little details and the steps first. And it helps you to become more versatile and definitely more flexible with your range of artwork that you can do. For myself, when I was younger, I started out with Bic pen and a piece of paper, so that is why I'm so used to working in this medium, and I think it's a lot of the reason why I'm also freehand, is because I started with pen, and I actually really don't like pencil myself. I can do it in pencil and I can draw with it, but I'm just really not a fan of the texture of pencil, and I don't like the look of it. It's just not bold enough. And for myself, since I'm just so used to just going with the flow of it, I don't really need to draft first. So I find that as well is just a preference that I've developed over time. However, when I'm teaching my students, or if I'm working with beginners, things like that, of course I'll teach them how to draft in pencil first and do all the steps that it would take to get to eventually getting to a stage like this. And because I did this drawing so long ago, these mountains are actually a lot more pointed than I would have liked. So I might go in and try and fix those a little bit, because really no mountain is perfectly a angled look like this. Usually they're a lot more ragged, but it's one of those things that the older you get, the more that you know, the more you start to notice things that may be a little bit different than how you initially started drawing them. So probably this drawing is more like 2.5 years old. So I can see a lot that I could have done differently now compared to even when I started this drawing. But drawing scenery is definitely one of my favorite things to do. I just tend to default to scenery when I'm not really working on anything else, and if it's my own personal work, tends to be a lot of scenery in with it. And I almost always incorporate trees and mountains and a big moon in the background. And I do like to also do pointillism, so there's a lot of dot work within this and shading as well. And it's a little bit different working with Bic pen. It does take a lot longer than some other mediums, which is why I don't really do it all the time. It's one of those, it takes a lot of commitment and a lot of time to work on a piece like this. So I tend to just do one now and then, even though it is my favorite style and medium to do. It just tends to be not the most quickest of mediums to work in. I have done full poster board size drawings, and they have taken me months to complete, of customers' houses and animals and cars. And definitely you get faster at it over time, but ultimately when it comes down to it, it still takes a lot longer than, say, if you were to paint with acrylics or oil paints or things like that. Even charcoal is completely different altogether. So I find each medium has its ups and downs. I really like working with oil paints as well, but again too, it also is very time consuming. It's a lot more of a harder medium to work with in the fact that it doesn't dry fast, and it also has quite a smell to it. And if you're working indoors or in a tight space, you don't really want to be having paint thinners and things smelling all the time. So that's why I try not to do too many oil paintings, because between the cure time and the amount of time for drying and then the smells, same thing, it's a medium I really love, but it's one that I don't do very often. Now that I'm in a bigger setup, I'm definitely going to be getting into a lot more oil paintings though. And I think too, I'll be doing a lot more of finishing up a lot of these pen illustrations that I have on the go that have just been sitting around that I start and then I just never finish, or I've got, a little bit of things left in it to finish up before they're complete. I've also gotten into working with Bic pen fine tip permanent marker, and I do like it, but I do find that it is too inky to allow you to do full detailed shading like this. So a Bic pen definitely is more controlled, and it gives you a more flexible medium to work in. But you do need to be quite good with your pressures, because the difference between a hard pressed line and a thinner line is going to give you the differences in the shading and the darkness level. So that's what a lot of this cliff is right now. It's just a matter of doing line work and shading and using different pressures to help build that level up. And by using quick, short motions downwards, pulling towards me, it gives kind of a faded off look at the ends of every pen stroke that I do. And so that too helps with the different shading levels. And I will sometimes pull down towards me, and other times I'll also pull back up. It just depends on what I'm doing at the moment. And since I'm working on rocks, I'm kind of doing a variation of pen strokes. And this style of trees and forest is definitely more my own. It's not really based on any one thing. Obviously these trees are more abstract. There's almost kind of a birch tree in the background, but for the most part this is all more my own style of doodling, because more realistic looking trees are obviously going to be a lot different than this. So if I'm working on my own, it's a lot different than when I'm working on a commission piece. This part of just shading in an area, especially if it's cliffs, can be kind of tedious and very redundant, but once you get to the final look of it, it definitely pays to have spent the time to do all of this extra work within the cliffs. I find that when a customer is looking at a piece like this up close and in person, they're going to really take some time to look at every little detail of your drawing. And I find that it brings the eye inward as you go as well. And I do find when you're working with a Bic pen and it starts to warm up, this is just a cheap Papermate Bic pen that I got from, I think, Walmart or Dollarama, one of the two. But they start to heat up the longer that you hold it in your hand, and the ink begins to flow better. So the longer that you use it, the better the flow of the ink, I find. And in this cliff corner, I'll probably darken it in a bit more. And now, because I want to darken in this cliff in behind, I am now pressing harder towards the darkest part of where I want to shade, and then lightly going upwards. And that's creating individual little pen strokes that start to all build into each other. So even if you have a line that isn't completely straight up and down, the more that you build that same look in one spot, the more shaded and filled in it's going to look. So it's okay if not all your lines go together. And I'm really not being too particular about this, just kind of filling it in. And I don't have any music playing in the background because right now I don't have any music that I can play without having it be intrusive or copyrighted, and I find a lot of the free to use music is just really not what I'm looking for, so it's kind of frustrating to keep trying to find different music to put in here. So I've decided to not bother with the music for right now until I can figure out a better method or something that I can use as a filler in the background more. I'm still pretty new to using Twitch, so for me, it's all kind of a learning curve. And I do find when you're working on a piece like this and you're doing the same thing over and over, your hand can get quite sore very fast. So if you get kind of tired of doing one thing for a bit, it's good to switch it up and work on something else for a while as well. But for me, I am fairly used to doing work like this, so I can do this kind of work for quite a while. But if you're brand new to it, you're probably going to start to feel it right away. And same goes for a lot of other mediums that I work in. If you're painting for long periods of time, or if you're doing a window painting, things like that, it does take a toll on your arm and your hand. And definitely getting up and stretching and taking a break can help a lot with that and keep you from paying for it for the next day. So not too much left of this cliff to work on here. Sometimes when you're working in pen, you can end up with pen on the outside of your hand. So depending on if I have to go in and work in an area where I wasn't working before and pen was just laid down, I put something over top of that spot so that I don't get pen on myself and spread it all over. Okay, so I think that's all I'm going to do on the cliffs for right now. I'll probably go back in a bit here and do a little bit more darkening in to give it more of a pushed back in look, because it definitely makes it look more 3D and it pulls your eye inwards. So it gives that illusion of shadow and depth when you're doing cliffs like that. So I like to darken in crevices and rocks. So I'll probably do some more darkening in this area here once I've got some more details added into this upper part. So I might try and get those mountains to be a little less angled. So the way that I would do that is I'm just going to go in and just add some more rocks to it. And just very lightly add in some shading so that it looks like it was just the same, like it was drawn all at the same time, even if it wasn't. And I might shade in some of that tree a little bit more too, so that it blends in and isn't so stark of a contrast, because we're going to have a bit of mountain coming in from behind. So I'm just doing some shading, lines one direction, and then some lines the other direction, so cross hatching. And very, very lightly, but just enough to give an indication that there's a bit of a mountain in behind there, even if you're not really seeing the full details or the full mountain itself. And again, not being very picky about it, because really when somebody's looking at this, they're not going to be looking at this specific little spot. They're going to be looking at the overall look of it. And same over on this side. This mountain is just too pointed. So I'm going to give it less of a point. And then shade in some of that to give the same idea of rocks and crevices on those mountaintops. And this is one of those things that the more that you work on things freehand, the easier it becomes to alter things and fix them as you go, or if you go back in later like I am and change it up a little bit more. So just by adding a little bit of shading, that begins to make it look like it was part of that mountain to begin with. Excuse me. And sometimes if you switch Bic pens and it's a little bit of a different brand or something than what you were initially working with, there may actually be just a slight difference between the shade or hue of black. And as well, since this is just on a standard piece of printer paper, I now know the difference as well between using just a generic piece of paper and using a acid-free piece of paper. Acid-free paper won't allow your ink to degrade and begin to eat away at the paper, and it becomes fragile and tears and starts to yellow over time. So that's why it's better to use that kind of paper than to use a piece of printer paper. Because this is so old, it actually is starting to yellow. And I don't know if you guys can see that up close or not, but there is some yellowing going on in there. So I'm probably just going to cover it up with some shading. But that is part of the problem with using printer paper, is over time, it is going to definitely degrade faster than using an acid-free piece of paper. But when you're just starting out and you're working on drawings and you don't have the money or the extra expenses to afford fancy papers, it's definitely more than okay to just work on whatever paper you have around. I do still have artworks that are 15 years old or better that are done on regular paper, and they are still around. They're just a little yellow sometimes, or if they got in the light, things like that. That can also change the paper quality over time. So I'm just adding a little bit here and there to make these mountains a little less pointed. And already I can see that it definitely has helped to improve that look already. And using pretty much the same technique as I used on the cliffs with the shading part of this. So for this mountain here, I'm not really liking the look of it, so I think that I'm just going to try and add some more ridges in there to give it just a little bit more of a rocky look in this section, because the pointed look is just not working for me anymore. So maybe there's a part of this mountain that comes in front of this mountain and a little bit that goes up in behind. So by putting your shading in the right spots, it can help to push parts of your mountain back into your drawing. And I think that that's all I'm going to be doing with that part to help give it a little more depth. And I am darkening in quite a bit here. And then same with in these cliff areas, I'm going to be darkening in a little bit more since some of this ink has definitely faded a little bit since I initially drew this. Just by touching up some of those details, it will help make it more vibrant again. And shading over some of that yellow to bring it back to that gray look that I'm looking for. So if you're ever working on a big pen drawing like this and you're wondering how I'm doing shading that is so evenly just in one line, and if you look at it very up close, you're going to see a lot of very, very thin lines that all go one direction. That is not something that is easy to just start with. It takes a lot of practice, but by doing, say, a solid line and starting to practice those lines by doing quick motions outwards in as straight of a line as you can, you'll start to build that linear cross-hatching, and eventually you'll be able to get into a rhythm of shading in one spot in one direction. But it does take a while before you really get the hang of it. So if it's not looking right at first, just keep on practicing and keep on trying, because shading with pen is definitely a test of patience and pretty much as well how good of pressure and how steady of a hand you have. But definitely something that I've gotten better at over the years as I've been working away at it. So now that I'm done most of the upper area, I'm probably going to go in and do some more of that shading on some of these little cliff pieces. And now I'm just doing quick upward strokes to darken in certain areas of the cliffs that I feel should have some more shadow to them. So it is covering up a little bit of that detail that I put in, but that's okay because you can still see it in many parts of this drawing. And I do find that it just helps to give more detail overall. So adding in elements like this and different levels of shading is really going to help to bring your drawing out. And pressing down and gently pulling upwards to help fade that pen line out. My paper is kind of curling up a little bit, so either laying a heavy book on it afterwards or just bending it back the other direction while you're working on it can help. It's mainly just due to the amount of ink that I put in one spot that it's curling at the moment, so it will lay flat again. It just happened to be that I shaded fairly hard in that spot. I find it just lays the ink down faster if you use this method. So for this one, I think I'm just about done. I could go in with like colored pen and I could do this in full color as well. But since this one was just one of my doodles that I was working on, I don't think I'm going to. I really like the black and white look of things. So for myself, sometimes people are like, oh, that's kind of a dreary piece, or it looks really dark and, you know, it's not really their thing. Myself, I really enjoy the look of this, so I like the black and white. But I can do it differently if needed, and usually when I'm working on things for other people, it's in color or it's painting or things like that. So I find that for myself, to appease my need to draw scenery, sometimes by just working on a pen illustration here and there, that's enough to get the tree kick out of my system. Because there's so many other things that I could draw and a lot of other things that I could be working on. But instead, my default is always trees, which isn't such a bad thing. But not everybody likes to look at a tree all day long. I've never actually drawn any kind of scenery from a reference. This is always on my own, all freehand, nothing that I took from a picture. It's always just drawn from whatever happens, really. So if I ever travel to the mountains or to Banff or Jasper, I might try and do a painting or a drawing where I just sit down and I actually look at the scenery and I draw from what I see, because I feel like now at this point in my stage of art level that I could probably sit down and do a pretty nice drawing of whatever I see in front of me. I have done photograph references for portraits or for animals, things like that, so I can draw from a picture or from an actual object. I just tend to not. And I think that is also a lot to do with just having started with the medium that I started with, and the preference to not use pencil, things like that, have all added to the learning to go with the flow part of my styles. The only thing when you're shading in with pen and you start to darken in an area, the more you want to darken in more of it. So I'm actually darkening in quite a bit of it here. And I think right in here might need just a bit of shading as well. So this kind of shading is a lot lighter. It is going and dragging the pen in one direction in a smooth, continuous line. So I'm not actually moving my hand. I'm holding the pen quite steady and at the same angle. And as lightly as I can, I'm doing smooth motions to connect into the rest of that shading. And the more times that you go over a spot, the more solid of a shade look that it gives. But it does take a bit of practice, because if you press even just a little too hard, that one spot is going to be more shaded than the rest. And once you get really used to it, then you can go back and forth without worrying about messing up your drawing. If you're confident that your shading is good, then you don't have to worry about doing very slow lines. I've had people think that this was a printed design for many of my pen illustrations. And I'll do just a little bit more shading in here. And sometimes when you're working on old works, you do start to notice a lot of things that you want to fix or continue to work on. And in this case, I see a lot of things that I could keep on adding details to and shading to, like the rocks that actually needed some depth to them there. Same with this rock here. A little bit of extra shading helps to push it into that background rather than stand out from it. And I'm going to do the same with this tree. Just by adding a little bit of cross hatching at the bottom will help to give it more of a connected to the ground shaded area here. And it's really not a whole lot of shading, it's just barely enough extra pen in there to help blend it in a little bit more. And same with this tree here. So I'm actually shading quite a bit of all of these tree trunks in at the bases, just because I'm noticing that there is a bit of a contrast between that ground and where the tree starts. So I think I like that where it's at for the moment. So I think that drawing I am going to call done. So the last thing whenever you are finishing up your work, always make sure that you sign your work, because one day maybe somebody might buy it or you might gift it to someone and someone might want to know who created it. So for myself, I usually try and put it in the bottom left corner if I can, and if not, like in this case where it's so dark here, then I'll put it up somewhere else. So for me, I might put it, maybe I'll put it over just a little bit so it's more in the open. And I am using a fine tip permanent marker here just because it'll stand out a little bit better against all this black. And maybe along some of your cliffs, you want to add some grass. So I'll just add some grass in a little bit here and there. And by doing quick upward motions that aren't in a straight line and at different heights can help to give that look of grass to wherever you need. And also doing it again at different pressure levels will help to also make it more natural looking. And so if you did this several times, then it could be more of a shrub look, or it could be a bushier part of grass. It just depends on your preference really there too. I think some grass definitely helps also to give it more of a natural look. So same thing with this here with the grass, not really worrying about what it looks like, because one little piece of grass isn't really going to catch anyone's attention overly. It's going to be that overall look again that they're going to be seeing. So the visual of having that indication of grass, whether it's a perfect piece of grass or not, is really more what people are going to notice. So that's why I did just grass in all kinds of directions, because really they're just going to know that that is grass there, whether it's a great looking piece of grass or not. Alright, so with this one you could just keep on shading and adding more and touching up every little single thing, but I think that that's all I'm going to do for this one here. I might grab another one to finish up because I've got several unfinished pen illustrations that I'm working on. So this one is finally done after many months of not actually finishing it. So I usually sand the front, and then I will also put it on the back, and I'll put the date that it was finished in, and January